January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before a room full of reporters at his headquarters in Belgium. He had called this press conference himself. He wanted to set the record straight about the Battle of the Bulge, about his role in stopping the German offensive, about what really happened when the Americans needed help. Montgomery wore his trademark beret with 2 badges. He looked confident, almost relaxed. The correspondents from Britain and America waited with notebooks ready, expecting the usual military briefing about enemy casualties and territorial gains. What they got instead would nearly destroy the Allied command. Within 24 hours, General Omar Bradley would be drafting his resignation. Within 48 hours, Winston Churchill would be scrambling to save the Anglo-American alliance. Within a week, the entire command structure of the war in Europe would be on the verge of collapse. To understand what happened at that press conference, you need to understand the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. 29 German divisions smashed into the American lines in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack achieved complete surprise. The Germans broke through weak American positions, created a bold 60-mile-deep penetration in the Allied lines, and threatened to capture the vital supply port of Antwerp. Entire American divisions were surrounded or routed in the first 48 hours. It was the largest and bloodiest battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II. Over 89,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. The first few days were chaos, panic, and desperate fighting in snow and fog. On December 20th, 4 days into the German offensive, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made a controversial decision. The German Bulge had split the American front in 2. Communication between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the Northern American forces was difficult and unreliable. Eisenhower decided to temporarily place Allied forces north of the German penetration under Montgomery's command. This included the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson. Both were American armies that had been under General Bradley's command. Bradley was furious when Eisenhower told him these were his armies. He had commanded them since Normandy. Now they were being given to Montgomery, the British general Bradley distrusted and resented. Bradley argued fiercely against the decision. He told Eisenhower the communication problems were temporary and manageable. He said giving Montgomery command of American forces would be seen as a vote of no confidence in American leadership, a public humiliation. He warned it would be politically explosive back home. Eisenhower overruled him. The decision was made for operational reasons, Eisenhower said. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern sector. He could coordinate the defense more effectively. But Bradley understood what this looked like. The Americans had been hit hard. They had been caught by surprise. Now a British general was being brought in to fix the problem, to command American armies, because apparently the Americans couldn't handle it themselves. Montgomery arrived at General Hodges' First Army headquarters on December 20th like a man coming to rescue a sinking ship. He later described the situation he found as one of complete disorganization and confusion. He claimed American commanders didn't know where their own units were. Montgomery's chief of staff later wrote that they found Hodges exhausted and uncertain. Montgomery immediately began reorganizing the defense, pulling back American units to create stronger defensive lines and preparing reserves for counterattacks. To be fair, Montgomery did competent work. He organized the northern shoulder of the Bulge effectively. He coordinated British 30th Corps moving in as a strategic reserve behind the American positions. The defense stabilized under his command. But the real hero of the Battle of the Bulge was George Patton. On December 19th,
3 days after the German attack began, Patton performed one of the most remarkable feats in military history. He disengaged 3 divisions from his Third Army, turned them 90 degrees north, and marched them 100 miles through winter weather to attack the German southern flank. On December 26th, Patton's forces broke through to Bastogne, relieving the surrounded 101st Airborne. By early January, Patton was driving into the German Bulge from the south, while Hodge's First Army attacked from the north. The Germans were being crushed between 2 converging American armies. By January 3rd, the German offensive was clearly defeated. The Wehrmacht was retreating. The crisis was over.
That's when Montgomery decided to hold his press conference. He told his staff he wanted to clear up misconceptions about the battle. He wanted to give credit where credit was due. He wanted the British people to understand the role their forces had played. His staff advised against it. They warned him the Americans were sensitive about the whole situation. They suggested letting Eisenhower handle any public statements about the battle. Montgomery dismissed their concerns. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery faced the press. He had notes prepared. He had thought about what he wanted to say. He was going to set the record straight. Montgomery began by describing the German offensive and how he had taken command of the northern sector. Then he said something that made the American correspondents stiffen in their chairs. "The battle has been most interesting. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. One of the most interesting battles he had ever handled. Not Hodges had handled, not the American forces had handled. He had handled." He continued, "The first thing I did was to get the battle area tidy, to get it sorted out." He described how he had organized the American forces, positioned reserves, and prepared for counterattacks, all in the first person, all about what he had done. Montgomery went on, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse River, they would certainly not get over it. I deployed the whole available power of the British group of armies, and finally it was put into battle with a bang." He was describing British forces as the decisive element. American reporters started writing faster. They knew this was going to be controversial. Then Montgomery said the words that would cause the real explosion. "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. This power was brought into play very gradually and in such a way that it would not interfere with the American lines of communication. Finally, it was put in with a bang, and today British divisions are fighting hard on the right flank of 1st U.S. Army. You have thus the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of American forces who have suffered a hard blow. This is a fine Allied picture." The American reporters understood exactly what Montgomery had just implied. The Americans had suffered a hard blow. They couldn't handle it themselves, so the British commander came in, organized the mess, deployed British forces to protect them and save the situation. You have to understand, American soldiers had just spent 6 weeks bleeding in the snow. They had held against impossible odds, and now Montgomery was telling the world he had saved them. It got worse. Montgomery said, "The battle has been a great Allied victory. I think the operations to seal off the salient now being carried out are being very well handled by General Bradley." Now being very well handled by Bradley, after Montgomery had sorted everything out. A reporter asked about Patton's role in relieving Bastogne. Montgomery's response was dismissive. "Patton has done very well indeed." A brief acknowledgement, then back to talking about his own dispositions and decisions. The British press loved Montgomery's press conference. The London papers ran headlines about how Montgomery had saved the Americans. "Monty clears up the mess," read one headline. "British general rescues Yanks," proclaimed another.
British correspondents wrote stories emphasizing that when the Americans got into trouble, they had to call on a British general to bail them out. Montgomery was portrayed as the experienced professional who stepped in to save the amateurs. The tone was triumphant, even gloating. The British public, exhausted by 5 years of war and sensitive about playing second fiddle to the Americans, ate it up. Montgomery was their hero again, like after El Alamein. He had shown those cocky Americans who the real soldiers were. The American reaction was volcanic. American correspondents who had been at the press conference immediately filed stories emphasizing Montgomery's arrogance and his dismissal of American contributions. They emphasized Montgomery's constant use of the phrase, "I handled," throughout his remarks. Within hours, American newspapers were running editorials condemning Montgomery's press conference. The tone was one of shock and anger. After American soldiers had borne the brunt of the German offensive, after American forces had done most of the fighting and dying, Montgomery was claiming credit? Military newspapers like Stars and Stripes were particularly harsh. GIs in Europe read Montgomery's words and were furious. They had fought the Battle of the Bulge. They had held Bastogne. They had stopped the Germans. And now some British general was taking credit?
General Omar Bradley read the press reports at his headquarters in Luxembourg. He had endured Montgomery's arrogance for 2 years. The condescension, the credit stealing, the barely concealed contempt. He had swallowed his pride when Eisenhower gave Montgomery command of his armies. He had accepted the implied criticism of his leadership. This press conference was the last straw. Bradley sat down and wrote out his resignation as commander of the 12th Army Group. He would not serve under these conditions. He would not watch Montgomery steal credit for American victories. He was done. Bradley called his staff together and told them what he planned to do. His chief of staff supported him. His army commanders supported him. If Bradley resigned in protest over Montgomery's press conference, several other senior American generals would likely resign with him. When Eisenhower learned that Bradley was drafting his resignation, he knew he faced the worst crisis of his command. If Bradley resigned, it would explode into a massive Anglo-American political crisis. Congress would demand investigations. The American public would be outraged. The alliance might not survive. Eisenhower called Bradley and asked him to hold off on the resignation. He promised to deal with Montgomery. He said he would make it right. Bradley agreed to wait 48 hours. Then Eisenhower called Montgomery. The conversation was tense. Eisenhower told Montgomery that his press conference had caused a firestorm. American generals were threatening to resign. The command structure was on the verge of collapse. Montgomery was genuinely surprised by the reaction. He seemed almost baffled. He claimed he had been trying to praise the American soldiers. He had said it was a fine Allied picture. He had called it a great victory. What was the problem? Eisenhower tried to explain the tone, the emphasis on the phrase, "I handled," the implication that Americans couldn't manage without British help, the dismissive treatment of Patton's achievement. All of it added up to an insult that American commanders couldn't tolerate. Montgomery still didn't fully grasp what he had done. He agreed to issue a clarification, but he didn't think it was necessary. He felt the American reaction was oversensitive and political. Winston Churchill understood the crisis immediately. He had worked for years to maintain the Anglo-American alliance. He knew how important American support was for Britain's survival. He knew that if this situation exploded, it could damage relations for years. On January 18, 1945, Churchill stood up in the House of Commons to give a speech about the Battle of the Bulge. He had written it carefully, knowing every word would be scrutinized by Americans. He needed to undo the damage Montgomery had done. Churchill praised American leadership lavishly.
He emphasized that the battle had been overwhelmingly an American fight. He made it clear that Montgomery's role had been supportive and temporary. He gave credit to Eisenhower, Bradley, and American soldiers. Churchill said, "The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours." That is a point I wish to make. United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. He continued, "I never hesitate to stand up for our own soldiers when their achievements have been cold-shouldered or neglected or overshadowed, as they sometimes are. But we must not forget that it is to American homes that the telegrams of personal loss and anxiety have been going during these last few weeks."
Churchill's speech was a masterpiece of diplomacy. He praised Montgomery briefly, but spent most of his time emphasizing American sacrifice and leadership. The message was clear. Britain appreciated and respected American contributions. On January 21st, Montgomery finally issued his own clarification. It was less an apology and more an explanation of what he had meant to say. He emphasized that he had always had the greatest admiration for American soldiers and their commanders. But even in his clarification, Montgomery couldn't help himself. He wrote that he was absolutely devoted to Ike and thought he was one of the great Allied leaders of this war. The phrasing suggested Montgomery saw himself as Eisenhower's equal or superior, not his subordinate. American commanders read Montgomery's clarification and weren't satisfied. They knew Montgomery didn't really understand what he had done wrong. They knew he still believed he had saved the Americans in the Bulge. After Churchill's speech and Montgomery's clarification, Eisenhower went back to Bradley. He explained that he had done everything he could to repair the damage. He asked Bradley to withdraw his resignation for the sake of Allied unity and winning the war. Bradley agreed, but only after Eisenhower promised that Montgomery would never again command American forces except in the most extreme emergency. Eisenhower gave that promise. From that point forward, Montgomery would command only British and Canadian forces. Bradley also demanded that Eisenhower maintain personal command of the Allied offensive into Germany, no more temporary arrangements giving Montgomery expanded authority. Eisenhower agreed to that, too. The damage from Montgomery's press conference lasted for the rest of the war and beyond. The scars were permanent. American generals who had merely tolerated Montgomery now actively despised him. Bradley refused to even be in the same room with Montgomery unless Eisenhower was there to mediate. Patton turned Montgomery into a punchline. Jokes about British caution and arrogance spread through every American mess hall in Europe. The British-American alliance survived, but it was scarred. American commanders became more sensitive about British criticism. British commanders became more careful about public statements. The easy cooperation of earlier years was replaced by formal correctness and careful diplomacy. Montgomery himself never fully understood what he had done. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote about the Battle of the Bulge as if his role had been decisive. He genuinely believed he had saved the Americans from disaster. He saw the reaction to his press conference as American oversensitivity and political manipulation. History has not been kind to Montgomery's claims about the Battle of the Bulge. Modern historians recognize that while Montgomery did competent work commanding the northern sector, the battle was won primarily by American forces. The soldiers who held the initial German assault, the 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne, Patton's dramatic relief operation, these were the decisive factors. Montgomery's contribution was organizational and defensive. He helped stabilize a chaotic situation. But he didn't save the Americans.
American soldiers saved themselves with help from Allied air power once the weather cleared, and with Patton's aggressive counterattack. The British forces Montgomery deployed into the battle arrived after the crisis point had passed. They fought well in the final stages, but they weren't the decisive element Montgomery claimed they were. Montgomery's press conference matters because it revealed a fundamental tension in the Anglo-American alliance. The British had been fighting since 1939. They had experience, professional armies, and generals who had learned their craft in North Africa and Italy. They sometimes saw the Americans as brave but amateur. The Americans had massive resources, fresh armies, and were providing most of the men and material for the final push into Germany. They resented being treated as junior partners by allies who couldn't have continued the war without American support. Montgomery's press conference brought this tension to the surface in the worst possible way. His words confirmed every American suspicion about British arrogance. His inability to understand the offense made it worse. The crisis revealed how difficult Eisenhower's job was as Supreme Commander. He had to balance competing national interests, manage prima donna generals, maintain alliance unity, and win the war simultaneously. When Montgomery created a political crisis with his press conference, Eisenhower had to fix it. Eisenhower succeeded in preventing the alliance from fracturing, but at a cost. His promise to Bradley that Montgomery would never again command American forces limited his operational flexibility. His need to maintain American confidence meant he couldn't give Montgomery the focused single thrust toward Berlin that Montgomery wanted. The broad front strategy Eisenhower pursued in 1945 was partly driven by political necessity after Montgomery's press conference. He couldn't be seen favoring the British general who had just insulted American forces. The final irony is that Montgomery's press conference achieved exactly the opposite of what he intended. He wanted to give credit to British forces for their role in the Battle of the Bulge. Instead, he created a situation where their contribution was minimized and resented. He wanted to enhance his own reputation as a great general. Instead, he convinced American commanders that he was arrogant, tone-deaf, and untrustworthy. He wanted to establish that British leadership was still vital to Allied success. Instead, he guaranteed that British influence would be reduced for the remainder of the war. On January 7, 1945, Bernard Montgomery held a press conference that lasted less than an hour. In that brief time, he brought the Allied command structure to the brink of collapse. He turned American generals against him permanently. He forced Winston Churchill to spend political capital repairing the damage. He limited his own authority for the rest of the war. All because he couldn't give credit gracefully, couldn't downplay his own role, couldn't understand how his words would sound to exhausted American soldiers who had just survived the largest battle their army had ever fought. The press conference that almost destroyed the Allied command is a reminder that in war, as in all human endeavors, how you say something matters as much as what you say. And sometimes the best thing a leader can do is shut up and let others take the credit. Montgomery never learned that lesson. And on January 7, 1945, his inability to understand basic human psychology almost cost the Allies their unity at the moment they needed it most.